Order. Could I welcome everybody to the first meeting of this Parliament of the Justice Select Committee to be held in public session, and we're delighted that we will have the Prisons Minister and his officials to be interrogated by us today. Before I ask the witnesses to introduce themselves, could I ask the members of the committee if they have any declarations of interest? I'll begin just by saying that I'm a non-practising barrister, that I'm a member of the Unite and GMB trade unions, and I'm a patron to organisations in my constituency, the Hammersmith Law Centre and the Upper Room. I'll go round if anybody can either make a declaration or not as they wish. Start with Desmond.
Thank you very much. I would point out that on my declaration of interest is I am involved with an organisation called Whistleblowers UK. I'm a director of that, which is a not-for-profit company. I'm also involved with the APPG for whistleblowers as an officer.
I'm a registered barrister with an associate tenancy at number 5 Chambers, and I'm on the APPG for Access for Justice.
As declared on the register.
Thank you. So.
As declared on the register, I'm a solicitor. I have various other declarations on there. In addition to that, I am a member of Usdaw Trade Union, Community Trade Union, I'm a member of the Industrial Law Society, and a member of the Employment Lawyers Association.
I think maybe the thing I'll say is I was once on the Employers Forum for Reducing Reoffending that Lord Timpson used to chair, and so we collaborated in that respect, worth for the record now.
I'm a former Crown prosecutor. I'm a member of the APPG for Access to Justice. I'm a member of a number of trade unions, including the FDA, as declared.
Hi, I'm a member of the Executive Council of the GMB. I'm also a solicitor, although I haven't practiced since being elected, and I'm a member of a number of APPGs.
Thank you, Chair. I hold a practising certificate from the Solicitors Regulation Authority. I'm a member of Unite and GMB, and just an ordinary member of the APPG on whistleblowing.
Sure. And good afternoon. I'm Pam Cox. My interests are declared on the register. I'm a former professor of criminology at the University of Essex.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Tapper. Previous employment with the National Crime Agency, including some work in prisons against gangs.
Thank you very much. And I say it's a pleasure to welcome Lord Timpson and his officials to the first public session. It's perhaps no coincidence that we are beginning our deliberations by looking at prisons. Could I ask you, Lord Timpson, and your officials, just to introduce yourselves briefly?
Hi, I'm Amy Rees. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service.
Hi, Ross Gribbin. I'm Director General Policy for Prisons, Offenders and Analysis at the MOJ.
I think we know who you are.
I'm Minister for Prisons, Probation and Reducing Reoffending.
That's helpful. Could I just ask, I think we probably understand what the other two's roles are. Mr. Gribbin, could you just explain what you do?
Yes, I manage the policy group, so we advise ministers on decisions relating to this area, on prisons, offenders, by which we mean sentencing policy. And in addition to that, I manage the department's legislation programme.
Thank you very much. We'll go straight into questions, because I say we may sadly be interrupted by votes quite shortly, in which case we will have to adjourn for a period of time. But let me begin. Can I ask you, Lord Timpson, a couple of general questions? Earlier this year you said we are addicted to sentencing. So many people who are in prison shouldn't be there. Is that still your view?
I'm very clear that prison has a very important purpose to lock up dangerous people, terrorists, rapists, murderers, people who commit very serious crimes. But I'm also aware that there are many people in prison who reoffend continuously. 80% of offending is reoffending. And I think I've been going around prisons for 25 years, and I've seen too many people going in and out and in and out. And I feel passionately that we have a real duty to help a number of people who go into prison so we have fewer victims. Not to come round and round again. So I am very clear that we have a really important job to do to reduce reoffending and to protect the public.
We've seen some very authoritative reports recently on sentence inflation, and the government's commissioned a review of sentencing policy. Is this because you regard those issues as the primary driver of the current prison population crisis? So you set out with the presumption that there will be a reduction in the use of custody or a reduction in the length of custody?
The independent sentencing review that David Gork is leading is really important because we can't have more prisoners than we have prison places. It's dangerous. And when we came into government 136 days ago, what was very clear from the word go, that we were approaching a very serious problem where the police couldn't do their job and the courts couldn't do their job. So what's very important with sentencing is that we need to make sure that we follow the evidence, but we have enough prison places for the people who need to go to prison. Also, I'm aware that there's a lot of evidence out there that says that community sentencing can be very powerful for the right people at the right time.
So you mentioned community sentencing. What are the specific alternatives to custody that you think we should be making greater use of to reduce demand for prison places?
I've been fortunate to have been around this arena for some time, and I've seen some really good examples of community sentencing. And there is evidence, as I sort of said previously, where if you pick the right offender with the right offence at the right time, community sentencing can be very powerful. We'll give you two examples. One on electronic monitoring. Electronic monitoring has significant success rates. It can reduce reoffending by half than those who don't have electronic monitoring. And I'm going to Spain in 3 weeks' time to go and have a look at what they're doing there, because apparently in Spain they do some really interesting stuff that really supports victims as well. And one other example is probably the most interesting day I've had in this job since I took it on was I spent a day in Birmingham at the intensive supervision court for female offenders. And instead of most of these women would automatically have gone into custody, but the nature of the intensive supervision court meant that a lot of the women who we saw in the morning who were coming up from the cells were beaten and broken and looked very ill. And the judge who works with them all the way through their intensive supervision was working alongside mental health, addiction experts, housing experts, and diverting them away, not all of them away, but diverting them a number away from custody. And in the afternoon, I spent the time seeing the women who'd been going through this process for sort of 6 months plus. They looked completely different. They came in sort of bouncing. They had smiles on their faces. They were engaging with their sentence. They'd worked really hard, but the professionals who worked with them were also working really hard. So there are some really good examples of what works here in the UK, but I also think there are other examples overseas that we should look at as well.
Thank you. One more general question. You're the 13th minister to hold the prisons portfolio in the last 10 years. Does your appointment signal an end to the revolving door of prisons ministers? And what do you hope to have delivered by the end of your time as prisons minister?
Well, it's obviously not up to me to decide how long to keep this job, but I've been very clear with colleagues that I'm here to do one job and one job only, and I want to be here for some time because I'm passionately interested in this area and have been a bit of a geek for many years. And it's a privilege to have this job, but also to be here today. I've watched these committees on many occasions. In fact, I've been at one and had a very minor role a number of years ago. What is clear is when I walked into the office on the first day, this is a service under pressure. It's under real pressure. And I'm not saying this because I'm sitting next to two of my colleagues who I work with very closely. The staff have been amazing, not just the staff at Petty France, but also across the prison and probation service that I've been meeting since I took on the job. But it's been bursting at the seams. SDS 40 was a necessary start, but there is an awful lot to fix. And that is why I believe you need someone in this job for years, not months, because a lot of the decisions are complex. We're dealing with very complex people in a very complex system. And if it was the purpose of my job to get one or two things done, I don't think I would do the job justice. A lot of the things that need fixing are long-term fixes. So that's why the independent sentencing review is going to be really important. The 10-year capacity strategy, which we hope to announce by the end of this year, again, is really important. But I'd also like to point out that whilst we may come on to this later on in the session today, around prisons and certain probation units that aren't working, I've seen some examples of fantastic prisons that I'm really proud of. HMP Hatfield, HMP Drake Hall are outstanding places. I could show anybody and you would be proud of what you see. So I've been out and about a lot since I've done this job, but also before. I've read everything that I could possibly read. I've spoken to everybody I could possibly speak to in 136 days. And it is fixable. It really is fixable, but it's going to take a long time. And I think from my focus at the moment until Christmas, I know it's only a few weeks, but I've been working on this. I'm trying to be very, very clear on what I've been trying to do. Because whenever you look around, there are so many things that you could focus on, but I want to focus on the things that are going to make a long-term difference. So I'm finalising my plan, and there's still some things I'm going to do before Christmas. I mentioned about technology. I'm going to Spain because I do think there's some big wins on technology, but again, it needs to be thoughtful. I'm very interested in standards, the standards of our prisons and of our probation units. And I've been to Manchester to have a look there, and maybe we'll come on to that later if we have the time. I'm very interested in leadership and culture. It's something that I spent a lot of time on in my previous role running the Timpson business. But we need to focus on the priorities, and we need to focus on the evidence that works. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we've got so many thousands of amazing staff who've done incredible work over the last few years to try and support a system that has been just on the edge. So to answer your question very specifically, it needs someone who wants to be here, and it needs someone who wants to be here for some time. And I'd like to think that I'm the person to do that.
Thank you very much. I'll hand over, if I may, to Josh Babrinda.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome. Thank you for coming to join us. Good to see you again. So I wanted to ask about the early release scheme, SDS 40, that saw a number of ex-offenders released 40% into their sentence as opposed to 50. Are you able to share with us how many available places there were in prisons before that scheme came into force in September, and how many places did it unlock in the prison estate?
Clearly this was not the first thing we wanted to do when we came into government. And I remember the first day I got appointed, I thought I was actually going to go home, but I was put in a car and go straight to the MOJ and was presented with the capacity problems that we have had to deal with. One of the things that was clear was the early release scheme of the previous government. It wasn't helpful. There were no exclusions for domestic abusers, and speaking to prison governors and probation staff, they didn't like it because they didn't feel that offenders were being released in a controlled way. So the projections that we were looking at, then things changed when we had the civil disobedience in August, which made the situation even worse. So we got to the point where we had less than 100 places in the whole of the prison estate, which, to reiterate a point I mentioned before, is clearly not the place you want to be. So SDS is certainly a better measure to ease the capacity than ECSL was, and we think when this has come through, there'll be about 5,500 spaces that this will have created.
Awesome. And shortly after the first tranche of releases, I think it was the Prison Governors Association that said, look, within a year, we're going to be back to square one. Are you able to share with us when you would expect prisons to be reaching capacity again?
What is clear, if we hadn't have done SDS 40, we wouldn't be in a position where we are now, where we have some capacity. We don't know the exact timescales because there are a number of fluctuations. But maybe I could turn to Amy here for you to give us your reading on more of the details.
Of course. So worth a bit of detail just on the number of releases to your specific question. So there were two tranches, 1,800 and then a 1,200 tranche. The 5,500 figure will be what it generates in an entire year, of course, but those are the two retrospective releases that happened on those dates. It is certainly fair to say that that has brought us a really decent chunk of time. So 5,500 is what is expected to yield in steady state. 4,500 is about what we expect the incoming demand to be. But you will know the government also announced 2 interim measures, which is the extension of HDC and the RA changes, to try and buy us time so that we can get to the sentencing review, decide what needs to be done, take the legislation, etc.
So do you have a ballpark? As to, you mentioned the phrase decent amount of time. What is that?
So, I mean, a couple of things, as you will appreciate. One, we've got really good supply coming on next year. So we've got Mill Psych opening, which is the brand new prison, 1,500 places in April. We've got some house blocks coming online. We've got the demand coming in. But as you know, we are downstream. So it is very difficult to predict with accuracy that this amount of demand will come to us, because we obviously have to deal with what comes through the courts. Obviously, as we've just discussed as well, if you get events like we had in the summer, that very much changes your picture and you get a kind of speeding up. But we have definitely got enough time to get to the outcomes of the sentencing review, implement our 2 interim measures, which are April and then June, respectively, for RA and then HDC, and get us well through the autumn, etc., to then decide what the government wants to do in response to the sentencing review. So we are not now staring down the barrel of facing an immediate crisis like we were in the summer.
And next autumn is the time by which you expect, all other things being equal, this kind of reprieve to last for until prisons reach capacity?
We may get further than the autumn, yeah, because we also have natural cycle of a change in terms of what comes to us in demand. So there's a known thing called the Christmas dip. So you do tend to get a reduction in the prison population over Christmas. So you may well get round quite a bit further than that. But like I say, it's genuinely impossible to know what comes at you from a demand downstream perspective and any unforeseen events, etc. So it is impossible to give an exact date.
If I could add to what my colleague said, as you're probably aware, there's quite a lot of natural variation in the system. The kind of these demand numbers we're talking about, they can vary by sort of several hundred month to month. That's why when we release projections, we always give a central case, but we tend to give an upper and a kind of lower estimate. And so I think that's partly why we would not try and give you a sort of pinpoint estimate. Obviously, the system is still very busy, very full, but there won't be a kind of single moment that we can give you that precisely answers that question.
You can say surely now what percentage you are towards capacity. What is it? 97% 97%.
Indeed.
You told my colleague that you'll be okay until next autumn. Is that realistic?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's a kind of hidden question in there, which is at what level would we like to operate? As colleagues will know, we've been operating at over 99% capacity for the best part of 2 years. So it is possible, but very ill-advisable to run the system at that level. But as I explained, we will get a Christmas dip coming shortly. Then we will also get big supply. We've got good supply coming on. We've got a house block in Rye Hill. We've got a brand new prison. And then we've got the 2 interim measures. So there are lots of ins and outs, if you like. There are lots of pluses and minuses happening in the system over the next 12 months.
Why press on, Sarah?
Yeah, you mentioned being downstream and therefore sort of demand arises. My question was going to be, to what extent do you liaise with HMCTS about what the court capacity is and how many sitting hours there are going to be? And do you have a full statistic understanding of the relationship between the number of sitting hours of judges, the number of people who go through that system, and the number of people who are likely to then enter the prison population? And how does that get coordinated, if it does at all?
I'm happy to do it. James, that's helpful. So the answer is yes, we do have a full understanding. We have quite a comprehensive modelling process that looks not just at the court system, but also at the police and other kind of system partners. We essentially test the assumptions in that modelling with our kind of colleagues and other departments, with our kind of partners, and then we run scenarios to test what the different impacts would be. Of course, the process by which sitting days are governed in the court system is constitutionally kind of governed. That's not something that's purely a policy decision in MOJ, but we do look end to end and we make sure we plan for kind of whatever capacity is required.
Can I just add a couple of operational bits?
Probably not. But I'm afraid we are going to have to vote. We may have more than one division, so I'm not going to give a time. I'll just say, after the last vote, if people come back as quickly as they can, and we'll try and keep you informed of when that will be. I do apologise.
We'll be back by next autumn.
Order. The committee will now resume after the adjournment for votes in the House. And before we were interrupted, I think, Ms. Rees, you were just about to answer a question from Sarah Russell.
I was, thanks. So you were asking about the relationship between court sitting days and obviously what happens in prisons. And I was just going to add a bit of operational flavour, which is obviously we've been focused on the total number of prison places, but there are two things that add a layer of operational complexity for us. One is the category of prisoner. We have different prisons from category A to D, and where we've found that most pressure happens is in the reception prisons, so where they come in from court, so that's particularly important to us. And then the other thing is regional variation. We found that there has been more pressure in some parts of the countries than other. And obviously when we get very tight on places, when we're running at over 99% capacity, sometimes even if we have got a few places left, it's very difficult to get someone from the place where they arrive at court to the spaces that we might have, because they might be hundreds of miles away.
Thank you.
Thank you. Back to...
Thank you so much, Chair. Thanks for bearing with us. I'd like to ask a bit more about the risk assessment process that you went through to ascertain which offenders to release early and which to not. Can you tell us about how extensive that was, what tests you undertook, etc.?
So I guess there are two answers to that question. Ross might want to come in. The first is how the policy is written and therefore who is excluded by policy. So I think most of the committee will be aware, no sex offenders for SDS 40, no sex offenders, no terrorist offenders, no serious violence, so that's over 4 years. Everyone must be standard determinant sentence, meaning not released by the parole board or not released at the 2/3 point, which some of very serious offenders are. So there are a bunch of people that are just released, excluded by policy. We then went through a process of ensuring that people were ready for release. So that's the kind of operational process that we did. So that's licence conditions, checking on safeguarding, checking on any domestic abuse flags, making sure we've got preparation for accommodation, etc. I don't know if you wanted to pick up any policy.
I mean, as Amy says, the offences that are released, I presume it's SDS 40 that you're asking about. I mean, they're set in law when Parliament passes the SI. So that's a kind of policy decision made by our ministers and then obviously in turn by Parliament. And that doesn't kind of grant flexibility, but Amy's listed some of the safeguards that apply when we get onto the operational considerations.
And on the subject of risk, it's been super clear, I know you're aware of this too, that whether it's a domestic abuse commissioner, whether it's charities like Refuge, who I met with earlier today, significant concern from survivors that although a number of domestic abuse aligned offences were excluded from early release, there are domestic abusers who are convicted of things like common assault who did qualify for release. So can you tell us a bit more about how you sought to and how you continue to manage the risk posed by those individuals to reassure those survivors who are watching right now?
Well, the Minister may want to comment, and you can talk to the operational detail, but just to be sort of clear on the legislation only grants us the ability to change the release point by offence. So we couldn't have applied some of the other factors that you're talking about. We can only grant specific offences in the change that we can make. But I don't know, James, if you wanted to, or Amy.
Shall I just cover the operational bits quickly? So in terms of what we do, let's say in your case, to safeguard someone who's been released for common assault, but then there might be underlying flags. So we had all the usual licence conditions. That includes where people are registered for victim contact scheme, that they can have exclusion zones, they can apply for certain licence conditions, etc. to happen. So all of that licence period is usual. Also probation trained in those risk assessments, so looking for domestic abuse flags, looking for safeguarding checks, dealing with all the other partners. I'm sure you're also aware that there's MAPA levels in terms of how we manage people from multi-agency, public protection, etc. So all of the usual safeguards that probation would use are available in these release cases.
Just to be clear in answering that, sorry to interrupt again, that there's nothing you can do about the exemptions because we keep seeing cases. I can quote one I saw from Sky News today where a man who held a knife to his ex-wife's throat and threatened to kill her went to prison for ABH and so is not covered by the exemptions. But what are we supposed to do about cases like that? Just see them as collateral damage in the system?
Well, of course, we're bound by what powers Parliament's granted in the law, as you'll be aware, and so the government can only select by offence type. Obviously, in the future, in primary legislation, that could conceivably be changed, but at the moment, that is the nature of the secondary legislation that's open to us.
Well, I think maybe if I touch on recall. I mean, clearly, victims come first in our decision-making process. And the early release scheme that we inherited from the previous government had very high rates of recall, anecdotally. And that means we had too many victims and they weren't abiding by their sentence plans. We don't have the full data yet on recalls on SDS 40, but operational insights, and for me going around speaking to governors and probation teams, says the recall rates are not significantly any different from before the early release scheme. But I mean, recalls are generally too high, and that's one of the things that I really want to focus on in my role. But we've got 12,500 people in prison on recall, and it's far too high.
And to what extent has the government explored what Mr. Gribbin mentioned, the prospect of changing primary legislation to, I guess, close this loophole for the future?
Well, I mean, I think the independent sentencing review is clearly underway and is looking at a range of kind of questions. So I think that is currently underway, and I'm sure that we'll need to look at what they recommend.
Also worth being clear, the Lord Chancellor has been clear that SDS is not permanent change, that it will be reviewed after 18 months. So there will be a very good opportunity to consider some of these things you're talking about.
I'll ask one final question before wrapping up. That's on the victim contact scheme. So, Ms. Rees, you spoke about that in one of the answers to the questions that I just asked. Again, speaking with organisations like Refuge, it's clear that there are a number of victims and survivors who would have expected to have been contacted and who weren't under the SDS 40 scheme. There are, as I understand it, a number of requirements. For example, someone needs to have been incarcerated for more than 12 months before the victim or survivor is notified. Of course, when you look at the offence of common assault, sentences are often less than 12 months. So can you tell us a little bit about how you would expect to close that loophole and ensure that the victim contact scheme is comprehensive and covers all domestic abusers and all victims and survivors of that horrific ordeal?
I mean, as I said previously, victims come first in our decision-making process. And I've had the privilege, as I know you have in the past, of meeting a number of victims since I took on this role. And it just reiterates to me how important it is when we're making policy that they come first. What I'm also aware of is that since we've come into government, there's been a lot of changes that we've had to implement very quickly. But we've tried to do it thoughtfully and engaging all of our colleagues across the organisation. And I think they've done an amazing job in very difficult circumstances. And I'll come on to Amy on so far as the actual practical details of contacting victims. But from what I've been picking up on, the teams have done a really good job. But if there have been some examples that we will need to look at them, but maybe over to you about how it actually works.
So look, I genuinely think you raise an excellent point. As you might expect, we did something extraordinary in terms of SDS, and so we did a lessons learnt exercise. I'm very proud of the way the organisation managed something that really was, a difficult thing to do. One of the things that came out of the lessons learnt was about the victim contact scheme and the victim notification scheme. We did follow the letter of the policy when we did SDS 40, and we have checked and rechecked that. But what it has clearly given rise to, and I agree with you, is there is some confusion about how the scheme operates. So the victim contact scheme, as you say, is for specified offences over 12 months, including terrorism, sexual abuse, violent offences. You also need to opt in as a victim, and sometimes that opt-in process happens when people are at a very high state of trauma, etc., and they may decide one thing then and then later decide perhaps they would have liked to have been involved, or, didn't foresee other circumstances that might change. The victim notification scheme is a separate scheme for harassment and stalking, and there is no 12 months to that. And actually the opt-in rate is much higher for that second group. But I think we have learned some lessons that we need to have some discussions again about making sure people are clear how these schemes operate, how they find out about them, whether they get a chance to re-opt in, etc. And it's something we'll definitely be picking up with the ministerial team, because we got the same feedback of you, that we had really good contact with Domestic Abuse Commissioner and all the rest of it, but there clearly was some confusion about how the scheme actually operates at its heart.
Well, I'm pleased that you're looking at that, and I mean, I grew up in a home where domestic violence was pretty rife, so particularly close to my heart, and I'm pleased that you're serious about looking to curb some of these challenges, should there be another early release come the autumn or beyond.
Thank you. Dr. Shastrihurst.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I want to stay on the topic of SDS 40. And can you set out the impact the scheme has had on the caseloads of probation officers?
Yeah, so, would you want to pick that?
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah. Certainly go first. There is no doubt that, first of all, there's two ways that it impacts the workload of probation. First of all, when the scheme is in normal operation, people will be out for 10% longer, so they'll be managed on the balance by community for longer. But also, what was particularly difficult and added to the workload over the summer was the retrospective nature of the scheme, because what we had to do was prepare in 8 weeks and then 12 weeks for a release that we would normally have much longer to prepare for. Probation staff were absolutely brilliant in prepping for those group. We had multiple things that we were checking regularly, and they did really very well indeed at making sure the normal things were done. But it was done in a shortened period of time, and it did add to their workload. As we go forward, like I say, there will be a longer balance of time, but actually, as the Minister mentioned earlier, it's a much better scheme operationally than ECSL was, and that's because when someone arrives into custody, we will calculate their release date, and everyone will know that new release date, so there won't be any bringing forward of a check or changing of dates, etc. And that's the thing that really adds and contributes to a workload when there isn't the proper time to plan and prepare.
If I could, thanks Amy, if I could add, I spent quite a bit of time in my role with probation because I'm aware that this is a potential point of real pressure. So I'll give you one example. I went to Preston and I spent quite a bit of time up in Preston. And I think because we had this 8-week lead-in, and because I think the communication from the teams was really strong, we sort of galvanised the spirit of all the teams. So they really, there was a lot of overtime happening. There was, people were really going for it to make sure that the SDS 40 extra releases were going to work, because one of my main areas of concern was on accommodation, because we didn't want people to leave with no accommodation, because it's a big reason for recall if people don't have the right accommodation. But up in Preston, I was just really impressed with the detail that they got into. And I also went to the approved premises in Ellesmere Port and had a look at that. And again, it was a service really going to the limits, but I think they did a really good job.
You've touched on the limited preparation time that was had, and some of the steps you've taken around accommodation, for example. I wonder if you can go into a little more granular detail about what steps were undertaken specifically to reduce the risk of those who were being released.
Yeah, of course. So there's a few things. One, we held ourselves to business as usual standards, meaning we wanted domestic abuse and safeguarding checks done as normal. We wanted licence preparation done as normal, and all of the victim contact scheme done absolutely as normal. So we held ourselves to a business as usual standard of release. In terms of accommodation, colleagues might be aware, but we have 3 levels of accommodation that we actually provide directly from HMPPS, despite obviously not being a housing provider. The first is CAS 1, or colleagues may know it as approved premises. So they are our highest risk offenders, unlikely to have been in the SDS group, but they go out and they will live in an approved premise for a period of time. The second is the bail accommodation service, where we provide a number of places where people can go as an alternative to custody, or in fact on HDC at the end of the release. And the third, which was particularly pertinent to this group, is something we call CAS 3, where we provide 85 nights accommodation, so that we literally buy and pay for them and run that accommodation in the hope that what we can do is smooth the passage to them getting into the normal housing system, etc., which, as you know, can sometimes take a little bit of time. And what we're trying to do is avoid them being released homeless at the point of release.
If I could just add one more thing around employment. I mean, accommodation is obviously very important when someone leaves prison, but and as is to have a meaningful relationship, someone to look out for them, but it is also his job. And one of the things that prior to coming into this government, I was really involved in was on the employment side of things. And one of the important factors of when someone leaves prison now is they need a bank account. They need to be able to access, get a driving license back, or they need their digital identity set up. And I was really pleased how the staff in the prisons have been working. We actually now have a banking and identity administrator, and they work with the prison employment leads and the employment hubs. And I think that's been a really helpful addition, because when people are leaving, there's fewer reasons why they won't get recalled.
And you may or may not have the figures to hand, but in terms of those who were released under SDS 40 compared to those that were not released under that programme, what percentage had gone through the banking and ID administrator and had been set up to ensure that they had that smoother transition into post-prison life?
From my experience going around prisons and speaking to these teams, I think it will vary quite a lot between those prisons that are really geared up. For example, the Category D prisons and the female estate, where I spent quite a bit of time recently. They are really organised and quite experienced colleagues. In others, I think it's probably a bit further behind. But I think it's a really important step, and it's something that when I first started recruiting people from prison 20 odd years ago, wasn't even considered. But times have changed, and we need to make sure people have these, especially if they're going to be signing on, getting their universal credit. We just don't want to put impossible barriers in their way.
And sorry to press you on, you say it's a bit behind in some prisons. Do you have an overall figure of where it sits at?
I don't have a figure, I'm afraid.
Alongside the announcement of SDS 40 was the announcement that there would be 1,000 new trained probation officers by March of next year. Where are we on that? Are we on track for that, or?
Yes, I am confident we'll hit the 1,000 figure. I think it is worth saying, though, you've asked a lot about workload, that recruitment alone won't be enough in terms of probation. We do need to look again at the work that we're asking probation to do. Colleagues will know, but we did a reset where we looked again at the work we were asking probation to do, and particularly trying to make sure that probation officers are spending the right time at the right point in the sentence with those most at risk. I think we're going to need to keep asking ourselves, what work do we really want probation to do, particularly our fully qualified probation officers? Where do we best want to target their efforts?
Can I add two more points to that? I think it's really good news that we're on track on the recruitment, but I'm also really aware that it takes time to learn the skills to do this job really well, because a lot of the skills are not just the technical skills you need to know to do the job, it's the softer skills. It's how you build relationships and trusting relationships with the offenders that you're working with. Often you're working with for a long time. So I'm conscious that we can't just put someone in the job and expect everything to be great to start off with. It takes time. But one of the things that I'm really interested in, and it sort of fits in with a little bit what Amy was saying, is how do we really focus their expertise on the people with the highest risk at the right time in their journey through probation, is around technology. And what can we do to enable our probation staff to have more face-to-face time rather than time doing administration? Whenever I go and speak to probation staff and say, if you had a magic wand, what are the things that you'd like me to do to help you do your job better? The first thing they say is, please help us doing less copy and paste. So one of the real goals of mine is to see how we can embrace simple technology to enable them to have more of this, I call it arm around the shoulder time. And that's what they really want to be doing, not filling out forms all day.
Yeah, you indicated you want to come in. Was it on this point?
Yeah, how many staff would you expect to lose over that same period through retirement and or otherwise leaving the service?
So our attrition rate in probation for those grades that we're talking about, so the main grades, is about 6.5%. That's it was lower, it went a bit higher in COVID, and it started to come back down again. So that's our basic attrition rate. But I mean, I think within your question, you're asking, will we need to keep recruiting? The answer is yes. We will need to keep recruiting fully qualified PQIP probation officers at around or that same rate. But also, like I say, I think we need to look at the workload and what we are asking them specifically to do.
I think really my question was, what number of people are going to exit versus the 1,000 recruitment over the same period?
So it's about 6.5% for that grade. That's the number that we would expect. Are you asking how many will drop out, sorry, of the 1,000? No.
I'm trying to understand if I don't know how many people work in probation in total at the relevant grade or at more senior grades, because presumably you already have some gaps there. So does the 1,000 replace the number you would expect to lose through natural attrition?
No, that will be a considerable net increase, because at the moment there's circa 5,500 main grade probation officers and the attrition rate's about 6.5% of those. Right. So it'll be a net increase, but we'll have to keep doing that.
Okay, thank you.
And just for your information, we have 20,400 full-time equivalent probation staff.
Thank you.
Alex, I'm coming. I won't forget.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, just following up on what you said, Lord Timpson, it's encouraging what you've said about it's not just about recruitment, it's also about the other skills. The committee were at HMP Brixton last week, which was really interesting. And one of the conversations we had there with a very established member of staff who'd been there, I think, 35 years, was talking about the training that he had undertaken versus what new recruits were undertaking was vastly different. Back in his day, he might have done 2-3 months, I think, centrally of training before then being in the prison, and then obviously the day-to-day. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said you'd be lucky if they get 2 or 3 weeks now. And so then part of then the retention problem is the newer recruits are coming in and their expectations perhaps of what to expect is vastly different, and which is why then the retention rate at the lower levels is such a significant churn. So is that something, I know, apologies, Chair, I'm going wide in the original question, but is that something as well that the Ministry is looking at?
This is my perfect question. I'll make sure I don't go on too long, because just before I was appointed
wasn't a
into
plan,
this
Chair,
job,
I promise.
I just finished a significant review into prison officer training. So I'm hopeful that now I'm in this role, that a number of the recommendations that I suggest will be put into place. And a lot of that is around much more in-depth training, much more training around the softer skills, not rush training, more in-person training, a lot of training around how we support people, how we de-escalate problems, and how we have a long-term vision for training. So when someone joins, they have a really strong, clear idea of, if they are ambitious, how quickly they can progress through the organisation. So it's something I'm really passionate about. I've been involved in colleague training in the Timpson business for many years, so it's sort of at the top of the list. So in some ways I feel a bit sorry for the team at the HMPPS who are involved in training, because I'm on it all the time.
Can I just add a few bits broader about recruitment? Look, one of the things we're most proud of in the service since COVID is that we have recruited really, really well. So in terms of prison staffing, we're actually 200 staff over our full-time equivalent. That does disguise a bit of a problem, which we still find it easier to recruit in some parts of the country than others, hence why we're slightly over, because we use them to fill gaps in other places. But what is certainly true is our balance of experience and inexperience has changed as a result of that new recruitment. First of all, I don't want to be all negative about it. It's great to have new staff in. They bring loads of new things, technology, a different perspective, etc. So that's fantastic. But we definitely do need to work hard at, one, making sure we retrain and train those staff once they've arrived, but two, making sure that they do get the opportunity to learn. So we've been trying to do things like new colleague mentors, etc., because we find that people do leave most in the first 2 years, and so we are trying, it's an unusual job coming into a prison, and so we're really trying to put effort into those first 2 years when people arrive with us, and the balance of kind of experience and learning.
And I do need to go out to Neil to let him finish. Do you have other questions you want to ask?
Just a couple more, if I may, Chair. In terms of those released under SDS 40, how many have been returned?
So it's too early to have a full recall set of data yet. Just as the Minister said, operationally our perspective is that actually it hasn't increased that much. It's also worth knowing that in any recalls the profile is you're more likely to be recalled earlier in the sentence, so we might have expected a spike by now, which we haven't really seen come through, but it's just too early for that data. There hasn't been long enough left in the system since we released them.
And do you have a timescale of when you will have that data? Are you anticipating?
We'll certainly know more after Christmas about what's come through the system.
And you alluded to it earlier on in your evidence that the Lord Chancellor has said she'll look at this again and review the position in 18 months' time. What are the specific outcomes or indicators that will be used to measure the impact of the scheme?
Well, we're obviously, the Lord Chancellor's committed to transparency on the number of releases, which is a significant new initiative. We also have all of the usual management information that we track for any kind of releases. We've talked about recalls. Over time, the department will measure aggregate reoffending rates. I don't know, Lord Timpson, if you wanted to comment any further.
I don't think I have anything to add on that.
I may piggyback my final two questions. How many do you anticipate will have been released by the end of the scheme? And do you think it will be repealed at the end of that 18-month review period?
And we think the numbers will be around 5,500. And that was our intention. That was how the modelling looked at the beginning. And this is, it is our plan that it will be reviewed in 18 months' time.
And just to clarify, 5,500 will be the net impact on prison places. So obviously, depending on how long the scheme lasts, you'd see a rotating cohort going through that.
And just think on the ECSL early release scheme, where we had we took on these problems with that scheme because people were just released in such a rush. I think there were 13,000 people released on that scheme.
And probably didn't phrase the question as well as I could, but at the end of that 18-month period, do you think it will be repealed? Do you think we'll be repealing it, or where do you anticipate the direction of travel?
Well, obviously we've got the independent sentencing review, but it is our intention that in 18 months' time, that was our intention that it will be reviewed, and we'll see what the review says then.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Taz, do you want to come in?
Very quick. Thank you. We went to Snaresbrook and to Brixton last week, and there was reference on both occasions from individual conversations about trauma-informed training. Does everybody get that now?
It's a basic part of our standard officer prison training. So when a new recruit arrives, we do some of that training, and then we do specific bits of other trauma-informed training depending on what you're delivering in the estate.
And the probation service would get that to you as an automatic?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine, thank you. I wanted to ask specifically about probation and whether you've seen any returners, because I know there was a massive the attrition rate back in 2013 or whenever it was horrific. Have you had people back?
Yes, we have had some people back. We've also had some people that have decided to join slightly different roles, so they might be doing programme delivery or something of that ilk. And as I mentioned earlier, we have stabilised the attrition rate, so we're about 6.5% now.
And one other very quick question. 18 months, it's quite a long time. I guess there are things that you will have seen you might do differently. Is there any flexibility to change within that 18 months, or do you have to wait to the end before you change something?
I think it's our job to keep our eyes open, and I think it's really important in my job, is to, and as it is with Amy as well, to get out and about and speak to the colleagues who are actually looking after offenders and the whole processes they're involved in. So, I'm always open up. I'm really keen for ideas that are going to reduce reoffending.
I'm sort of, are you gathering stuff up on the way, and can you change the way you do things when the next one comes along, or do you have to wait the whole 18 months? You have to wait the whole 18 months before you can change things up for you.
So I think there's probably two answers to that. One is a policy answer, which I think Ross will pick up, which the options are, as we discussed earlier, which is either you do primary legislation or you do it in 18 months. Then operationally, we enhance things between tranche 1 and tranche 2 because we're learning all the time. We did a lessons learned. We will do everything we can operationally, but what I can't do is change the legislation because I can only act within it.
Right, we need to go on to a fresh topic. Can I just say, I'm entirely in the committee's hands, but given the time we lost for votes, the more time we spend on each issue, the fewer issues we're going to get. I'm sure the team will be keen to come back, but we must take this opportunity. So we move on to Wanda Just.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions on overcrowding. We know that our prisons are overcrowded, which is why we had the early release scheme. And as has been mentioned earlier, we did have a visit to a prison last week. For me, it was quite unpleasant to see 2 prisoners in a very small cell. And the questions that I wanted to ask you was, how many prison cells do we have which are currently doubled up? And Lord Timpson mentioned earlier that the problem is fixable, but it's going to take some time. So whilst the problem of overcrowding continues, what is being done to actually put in place some precautions, some provisions to ensure that the prisoners have a safe and healthy environment?
So maybe if I just sort of introduce the topic of overcrowding. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are about 10,000 cells that are deemed overcrowded. And these are single cells that were originally built as single cells that basically have a bunk bed in them. And overcrowding has increased over the years, and there are direct links when you have an overcrowded prison to increases in violence and increase in all the other, a number of other problems associated with violence, whether it's drugs and self-harm and so on. So it's something that I'm really aware of, because our prisons need to be safe places. I want people to be able to be in prison to do their time, but to do it safely, and to be able to engage with all the things we know they're going to help them not come back. So maybe if Amy just explains how it actually works operationally on overcrowding.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, the answer to your question is 23.6% of our population, and the Minister's given the number of cells. I govern Brixton, so I'm intimately familiar with the spaces there, and I agree with your assessment. It sounds like colleagues here are all aware, but I mean, just to be frank about what it means when we crowd a cell, it means that someone defecates at the same place that someone else eats their dinner. That's what it means. Yeah. It is certainly, we would like to have much less of it. What do we do to try and manage it? First of all, it's worth saying that we make a very careful assessment about whether we can tolerate crowding in any prison. That is made by the prison group director. It is signed off, something called operational capacity. We don't just decide on a Friday afternoon we'll put 5 more people. That absolutely does not happen. We make a proper assessment over time of the number of prisoners that can be held safely in any individual establishment, because it isn't just about the actual physical space in the cell, it's also about all the other stuff we talked about: access to education, access to work, staffing ratio, etc. All of those have to be considered. In terms of what we're trying to do, so first of all, we do try to limit crowding everywhere we possibly can and make a safe assessment about it. Second, we try to do some physical things in the cell. So you might have seen in Brixton, we try to have shower curtains and things around the toilet, because they're designed for one person. There is no covering to that toilet, etc. And then really most importantly of all, what we need to try and do is get the best possible access to the regime, because obviously that is not a place that people would want to spend hours and hours, and we need to give them the best possible access to coming out of their cells.
And so can I just give you an example at Wandsworth, where I've been to recently. Wandsworth has had well-documented problems recently, and we have a new governor, and there's a plan in place. And one of the benefits of having more capacity as a result of STS40 is we can start to do some of these important projects and to ease the pressure on the system. So in Wandsworth, we've reduced the capacity by 150 places to date, and probably I think we'll take some more out as well, to enable essential maintenance to happen, lots of staff training, and just to give the staff and the whole prison community there the opportunity to get back on the front foot. So it does give us some flexibility, but Amy and the team are very clear that there is a red line on crowding, and that red line does not get crossed, despite all the pressure we've had on the capacity.
Just one final question on this. One of the things we were told last week was that there are many prisoners who are not on drugs before they go into prison, but when they are inside, they start taking drugs. Have you made an assessment as to what part of that is due to actually prisons being overcrowded?
I don't have the exact figures on how that impacts overcrowding, but what I do know is that 49% of those in prison have an identified drug problem. So we have we have a clear problem we need to deal with, and overcrowding is one of the attributable factors to problems we sometimes see. But I also know of other prisons where they have overcrowding where the pressure is not so bad. But I don't have the exact. Do you have Any clearer idea on that, Amy?
I mean, the thing I would say honestly to you, I think drawing a direct line between crowding and then taking drugs would be genuinely difficult. I think it is more straightforward to draw a direct line between crowding, access to regime, access to staff and staff time, access to offending behaviour programmes that might help you, and these are all things that may lead people to then turn to drugs, etc. So I think a direct line is pretty difficult, but it definitely makes access to other things that might support you getting off drugs more difficult.
Thank you very much. And back to Josh Babberin.
Great. So I'd like to ask a bit about prison capacity. And over the last 14 years, we've seen a net change of 500 places added to capacity. As the prison population is projected to increase between 94,600 and 114,800 by March 2028, how many additional prison places do you think need to be built in order to satisfy that projection?
We'll be publishing the 10-year capacity strategy before the year end, and that's nearly ready to be published. But I mean, you're exactly right. Even though the previous government built 6,000 prison cells, they closed 5,500, so the net increase was only 500. And when the prison population, the net increase is, the general trend is 80 people per week at the moment. So that's 4,500 people a year. It doesn't give you much flexibility. So I'm really clear, we do need to build more prisons. We need to build really good prisons, and the prison design and the way they operate, for me, needs to have a real focus on reducing reoffending. So, as we mentioned before, HMP Millsike is opening up in the spring, and we've got other accommodation blocks coming on. So, I don't want everyone to think, though, that we only need new prisons. We have some Victorian prisons that are operating very well at the moment. I spent a couple of days in HMP Preston with the staff, just going around doing all the jobs that they do in a prison over a couple of days. And when you walk into the governor's office, they have a board of the names of all the governors and the year they first started their governing job. The first governor started in Preston in 1798. And Dan and the team there, who's the governor, they run a really good prison despite it being a very old prison. So I think it's a combination of we do need to build new prisons. We need to maintain the ones we've got so we don't lose them at the back end.
And, I mean, do you think with some of those Victorian prisons, or how many would you say are beyond maintenance? We heard lots about rat infestations and things like that are almost impossible, or have proven impossible so far to root out. We've seen and heard from other prisons, not dissimilar stories. I appreciate there might be some solid leadership at some of those Victorian prisons and solid programming, but the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure itself, how much of that is beyond repair?
Can I give you just two examples? HMP Dartmoor, which is currently closed due to health and safety concerns over radon. We are hoping to reopen HMP Dartmoor as soon as we safely can, because that's 600, maybe more, 600 places there. And I also went up to HMP Manchester because I'm sure you're aware it had an urgent notification notice. I've been going to HMP Manchester for over 10 years, so I've seen it through all different sort of the good and the bad. And this was the worst I'd seen it. There's, go in there. There's the sewage system under the prison's collapsed. There are rats running around. The big cool tower in the middle is collapsing. There's windows that haven't been repaired. So we've inherited a prison estate that does need to be maintained. So I don't just think it's about our prisons. It's just too far gone. No, they can be maintained, and maybe just sort of touch on one example. There's something called Q branch. They call it different things in different prisons, but essentially it's working with prisoners who have experience in maintenance. They work with a couple of prison officers who are experienced in trade, really, and they go around the prison fixing stuff, painting stuff, fixing doors, basic job. They don't do electrical things or anything like that, but there are lots of things that we can do, and one of the things that's really important to me is standards. I've never known a great organisation to have poor standards, and something I learned in business, you need to have really high standards. So one of the challenges I'm going to be setting HMPPS is an idea that I've been running the Timpson business for many years, called Perfect Day, I'd like each establishment and also a probation office as well, and I will do my own office as well, where on one day it is immaculate, the standards are really high, because those prisons that have high standards, I believe, have better results for offenders.
And as well as building capacity, a key part of improving prison capacity is around our prison officers. We've spoken about training, but there's a need to recruit more prison officers. What does the MOJ's plan look like to recruit the number of prison officers required?
Well, we have 200 over our number of prison officers at the moment. As Amy said, they're not all in the right place, and similar to what we're talking about with probation officers, they're not all experienced enough yet. So I think we need to keep recruiting, but also one of the things that I'm really passionate about is looking at retention, because you can work really, really hard recruiting people, but you don't want to be losing people just as quickly at the other end. And part of this is what we want to do on training, but also I think part of this is stability, because one of the things that I really feel in this organisation is that people don't want big change. They don't want a revolution of change. Every day we just need another step forward, improvements, just gentle improvements. And that is what I think will really improve staffing levels, retention levels, and that falls onto the prisoner experience and how we can reduce reoffending.
I ask about the plan because it's been pretty well documented that you have Unlocked Graduates as an organisation that has facilitated the training of many prison officers over a number of years. Features in the Sunday Times, Top Employers, etc., etc. And the MOJ has really relied on them to help fuel the recruitment of prison officers. We've seen an issue recently where there's been a breakdown of communication and relationship between the MOJ and Unlocked over the negotiation of a contract. Now, I understand you might not be able to go into the details of that, but at the moment, there seems to be a void. It doesn't look to be the case that there's a contract specification for the recruitment of more prison officers via a scheme like that. Certainly not for next year, and it's not clear what happens beyond that. So, are you able to share with the committee and those beyond this room what your plan is to kind of get that up and running again? Not necessarily with any single provider, but generally with a provider.
I'll start off and hand over to Amy if that's okay. I've been fortunate to work alongside many colleagues who've been through the Unlock scheme, and also as part of my training review I spent a amount of time, actually spent a whole day up in Leeds with the Unlock graduates on their course, and I think it's added a huge amount to the service as a whole, and also I'm pleased we've still got more graduates coming through until 2026, but this was another problem that we inherited, a procurement process that didn't work. So maybe hand over to Amy of...
Yeah, a couple of things to say. First of all, I totally agree with you that Unlocked has been a huge part of helping to provide cultural change in the organisation. And in fact, we've got a programme that internally that we're calling Enable, which is looking at staff training, how we develop managers at all levels of the organisation. And it's fair to say that a lot of that has been learned from Unlocked. It isn't quite true to say, though, that we've been reliant on Unlocked for numbers. They are relatively small in terms of what they do because it's specialist and because it's been more about cultural training. So the gap that's created by Unlocked for me is not one about physical numbers of prison officers, but it is about the cultural change, about people who might be brought into the organisation that would go on to much more senior roles, and we are thinking about that. As you know, there's still a live cohort of Unlocked, and they'll be with us for quite some more time, and if we do a re-procurement for anything like a graduate scheme, Unlocked will obviously be able to tender for that.
And what plans are there to do a re-procurement?
We are considering at the moment exactly what gap we want to fill and whether or not there'll be a re-procurement for something like we procured for before, because as you know we had a live procurement and not with the bidder, but in the end didn't sign the contract, which is obviously their choice, and we are working through now, would we do something similar, would we look slightly again, what specific gap is it we think we want to fill in the market.
Timelines on that? I ask because let's take Unlocked as an example. Without being able to understand whether something may be coming down the line, the likes of Unlocked themselves may be forced to close, altogether. what certainty can you provide, not just to Unlock, but to any other bidder that might want to enter the process, that something like this might be coming down the track?
Yeah. At this stage, the honest answer is no certainty, because we're still considering exactly what we want to do and what we would procure for, and if we would go out to market, etc. And we're working through that with ministers and the Lord Chancellor, etc.
Russell and then Lindsay Farnsworth.
On the maintenance, I had two questions, but both really focus on investment to save. So when we were in Brixton, one of the things I did was look up at the roof and watch the amount of heat that must have been going out through that roof. And I wondered how much of our prison estate, the day-to-day revenue costs of running it, are how long the repayment period would essentially be for capital investment, because some of that, I suspect, wouldn't be that long. And so I wondered if you had a breakdown of your figures on that £1 billion backlog of maintenance around what would potentially be invest-to-save schemes versus what is just day-to-day maintenance, and how you unpack and explore that. The second thing that I wanted to ask on this topic was that some prisons clearly have netting around them, which appears to be quite an important facet of dealing with drugs entering prison. The differential in quality between some netting and the standard of the fencing that is up, for instance, is huge. And I suspect that, again, there's a potential invest to save there if you took better physical steps in terms of reducing the number of drugs that went into prison and or the maintenance budget that is associated with the netting. So just wondered what work was being done on those types of issues.
Maybe if I just start and then Amy can help me on the details. Obviously, we've got enough money for essential maintenance, like as I described about HMP Manchester. These things need to be fixed, and they're getting fixed, and I'm on it, and I'll be going back in due course to have a look at progress. And when it comes to netting specifically, when you go to somewhere like HMP Bow in just outside Wrexham, it's a relatively new prison. It's a pretty new prison. I think it's 7 years old. A lot of the area is netted, and they have a low amount of drones coming in. Whereas HMP Manchester, which is in the city centre, doesn't have much netting and has a drone problem. One of the things that we need to make sure we do is it's not just about putting up netting. This is a cross-government piece of work to do. And the numbers, there's now restricted fly zones and so on. But it is important that our prisons have all the maintenance. We work through the maintenance. And when it comes to netting, I've had a number of conversations about netting. And you have to be careful about it. It needs to be snow-proof, where some of our prisons today will probably have lots of snow on them. So it's not just as straightforward about putting up a simple net. And one of the other points, which I'm sure you're aware, is that the people who bring drugs and illicit goods into prisons do so for financial gain generally. And when you close one door, they'll try and find where the next door to open is. So it isn't just a case of just putting a net across a prison and solving the problem. They're looking for all the weak points all the time. So it's something you need to be continually looking at.
Just a couple of bits of detail on maintenance. You mentioned the backlog. This financial year, we've had up to 220 million made available to us to try and spend on maintenance. Next year, so 25-26, up to 300 million. So that will give us a really good insight. Look, there's no doubt 25% of my estate is Victorian. They are more costly to run, both in maintenance and in day-to-day running costs, without a shadow of a doubt. The difficulty is, though, is that if you were to compare that to, say, Mill Psych, which has been built on a completely different specification, all-electric prison, modern fit-for-purpose sustainability, but converting Brixton to that, as opposed to, it is actually a very tricky and expensive job, and would probably require us to take all of the capacity out of use in order to be able to facilitate that. So our difficulties are the kind of money, the capacity in the system, and the cost of converting very old prisons as opposed to building new. But there is a vastly different maintenance cost to running those two things.
We've moved on to maintenance. Did you want to go back to?
Just briefly, if that's okay. Yeah, I think it's probably timely to, because you just mentioned again new prisons. So I think we'll come back to prison maintenance shortly. But just on the point of new prisons, it's great to hear that we've got Mill Site opening in April, and I think you mentioned a new block opening elsewhere as well. But I think it's clear from what the Minister has said that we do need to build more prisons and more purpose-built prisons for where we want to be in this country with the way that we want to sentence as well, potentially. But I think there's been challenges that the Ministry of Justice have faced previously in terms of building new prisons, particularly in relation to planning permission. And I'm just wondering what steps, it's probably a question more for the Minister actually, about what steps are being taken to improve the planning process for new prisons, and how soon can that be sorted out so that you can get on with building the prisons that we need.
You're right, it's really important that we get on with this. The previous government had long planning delays. That's why we got only the net 500 increase in prison places, which is why we've had the capacity problems over the summer, which is why we've had all the other associated problems when you have full prisons. So it's important that we really focus on this. And in our manifesto there was a commitment that prisons are nationally important, and we're going to go down the Crown development route. And I met earlier this month with Minister Pennycook as well to go through this. So it needs to be a cross-government approach, but it is really important that we address this now, because we can't be in the position that we were in July, where we arrived and seeing every day that we're getting closer to having no prisons. We need to build new prisons, but we need to build really good prisons.
And how are you going to decide where those prisons should be?
Well, shall I just add a bit of detail? So first of all, the 3 Gs, as we call them, so they're the ones that we're less to build, so Gartree, Garth, Grendon. We estimate that between 1.5 to 3 years has been added by planning permission difficulties. It is worth saying, though, that of the 20,000 portfolio, now over 87%, 17,000 places do have planning permission. So we have been through a lot of that process. In terms of where we decide to build new prisons, there's a couple of factors to take into account. One, we need a certain square footage, and we prefer flat land, as most people who build do. And then we have to consider things like transport links, and then it's what gap we're trying to fill. So obviously in terms of a Cat D or a Cat C prison, you can place those a bit differently from where you need to place a reception, for example, which needs to be really close to a court. And they are harder to find. And we really try to work with the local community. There are obviously things that people have concerns about building Leighton prisons, but we're also really good employers, both at the time of construction and afterwards.
There has been problems with construction, though, as well, hasn't there? I think that ISG was a construction company that collapsed, essentially. Yep. So has that affected specific projects that you've been working on? And do you have alternative contractors in mind ready to take over going forward?
This is on to be added onto the list of the number of problems that have come across our desks since we took over in July. When ISG went into administration, we've had 100 projects across the prison and court estate impacted. 79 will require reprocurement. We're on it quickly. We've had contingencies in place. I also think it's worth bearing in mind that other government departments have been impacted, unfortunately, as well by ISG, as have Tesco's and Marks and Spencer's and lots of other organisations. One of the bigger projects they've been doing is rebuilding some of the Victorian wings at HMP Birmingham. But I'm confident that it will mean we have some delays, but the team are acting really quickly and talking to construction companies who want to bid for this work, because I'd like to think that we are a good customer.
Thank you. Pam Cox.
Sure. Thank you very much. We're back to prison maintenance, if I may. In 2021, I understand there was a £1 billion backlog in terms of prison maintenance. Could you give us a sense of what the current figure is, 4 years on, 3 years on?
So far as the exact details on the backlog, I suspect if I went to speak to the governors of every prison and walked in every cell and every workshop and every laundry, it would be a figure that would be completely eye-watering. So we need to understand that the maintenance required is what is required, not necessarily wanted, because the prisons are, as Amy said, 25% are Victorian prisons. They all come in different shapes and sizes, and ages. But the backlog has doubled, but what's important, we need to focus on essential maintenance, and one of the priorities at the moment is focusing on fire safety upgrades. So we still have 23,000 cells that need fire safety upgrades, and that is a real priority for us. But obviously when one of the advantages of the capacity that we have gained ourselves, even though it's not significant, we've still got some capacity now. That means you can get these jobs done quite quickly and more efficiently.
And just to add, you mentioned quite an old figure. As you would expect, yes. We've recently conducted a condition survey, and we will be publishing that soon. So we've done all the work to go out again, and look exactly what that backlog figure is now.
Thank you very much. And as a follow-up, what kind of levels of autonomy do prison governors have in determining what's essential and what isn't, and in decision-making around contractual arrangements, procuring, that kind of thing?
So one of the things that I am very aware of is prison governors are great at governing prisons. They're not always great at at doing procurement processes. And when I was running the Timpson business, the buying team never let me anywhere near it because that was not one of my skills. So I think it's really important that the procurement processes are handled by the experts. But saying that, it's what I call the B&Q question. What can a governor spend to get something resolved quickly and locally? And they do have authority to spend £10,000 or less. There are proper procedures in place because it's public money that they're spending. But I'm still learning about the procurement rules in government, and the more I look at it, the more complex it seems to get. But it is important that governors have the ability to sort out small things day to day, but I don't want them being involved in big procurement processes. I'm also aware that one of the things that governors spend a lot of time doing is contract management. They have lots of big, complex contracts, and I just want to make sure that we really focus their time on governing the prison.
Do you think enough is being done on the management of those contracts in terms of the monitoring of effective performance? Because these contracts could be anything from replacing netting to running therapeutic services. It's a huge range of contracts services. Yeah. Are the mechanisms in place to ensure that their goal-oriented regulation is going on there?
Well, we need to be very careful. We're spending public money, so we need to make sure we get really good value for money, and what we're paying for is what we get. But maybe I'll hand over to Amy just on how you practically deal with that.
Yeah, so there are lots of mechanisms where we try and hold providers to account, as you might imagine. I won't go into all the detail of those, but it is absolutely for sure that governors would like more autonomy to do things locally and to do things speedily and more quickly. And we've been trying to trial some of that. So we've been trying to say, OK, give you a pot of money, let's see what you can do. One of the barriers that we're finding is, unfortunately, it is inherently inefficient to do small works in a prison. You need to be security cleared to come into us. You can only work at certain times of the day. You need an escort, etc. And what we're finding is, in some parts of the country, there isn't necessarily a massive market for doing small works. And what we have to do is try and package up the works that is, it's meaningful to a supplier, etc. So I definitely recognise what you're saying. We have really robust contract management. We are trying to improve where we can, and that's often at the smaller jobs, if you see what I mean. I think a lot of people understand that big contracts get let across government, but what about just small reactive things? That's where the Q branch comes in. That's where the 10,000 limit. But also we do have to package groups of work, because otherwise sometimes we just don't get people who want to do it in our environment.
Thank you very much. Just before we press on, I would like, with the consent of the witnesses and at least the majority of the committee, to go over time, to go to no later than 5 in order to make up the time we've lost. Is that okay? I understand some people may need to leave, but as long as we have a quorum, I want to take this opportunity. I still don't think we will finish. I will aim to get as far as the section on imprisonment for public protection, so that might affect both how quickly people ask an answer and also when they come in. So with that, can we go to, I think it's back to you, Lizzie, on
yes, that's right. I'd like to just explore with you a little bit adult custodial remand, if possible. The sentencing review is just that, it's about sentencing. So my understanding is it doesn't cover remand in custody. I'm just wondering whether you're seeking to reduce the number of people that are remanded into custody, and if so, what steps you're taking.
The independent sentencing review they've got ambitious terms of reference, and we've asked them to deliver their final report within 6 months. So they got a lot to do, and that's why we decided we wouldn't include homicide, youth offending, or remand or IPP sentences in that, because we're going to, apart from IPP, which I'm sure we'll come on to later, homicide, youth offending and remand we're going to deal with at a later date. So we wanted to make sure we really focus on that. I mean, so far as remand, I don't know what the exact numbers are. Oh, here we go. It's 17,662 people on remand, which is around 20% of the total prison population. And it's a significant part of our reception prisons, and it clogs up the whole system. But also, and this is certainly not all offenders on remand, but there are a number of people on remand who don't really engage in prison life and don't engage in education, personal activity, and some of the jobs that are on offer in the prison. We've increased the magistrate sentencing powers, and there are a number of things we're doing around bail information service. We're investing in that, so in all courts for that. But it's one of the ones where I'm really on this, but we need to keep looking for new options as well. Maybe Ross, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, of course, a couple of things to add. I mean, as you'll be aware, of course, the remand test itself hasn't changed. That's set in legislation that's been in place for a long time now. The evidence we have is that the actual remand rate hasn't changed. It's obviously difficult making comparisons, but that's the data we have available. So really the increased number of people on remand is a function of the outstanding caseload in the court system, and also some of the other pressures that the system is under. I think, as the Minister said, it is a very important issue. There's a lot of prison places currently being occupied by people on remand, and I think absolutely it's something that we're looking at. It simply isn't, as for the reasons the Minister gave, part of the sentencing review itself.
A couple of things, if I might add. One is that I'm really glad you mentioned it. We talked about sentencing earlier, but remand, recall and FNOs make up over 40,000 prisoners. So it is a really significant chunk in terms of what we do. In terms of what we've been trying to do, one of the things we can do if you don't change the remand test is try and put together packages for people that would mean that bail is a reasonable alternative for the court. So we've been investing in bail information officers to try and do that, to put together packages. That is very much linked, though, to what I was just describing in terms of accommodation, because as much as we can put together a package, what you really need for those people is an alternative, good, safe accommodation. So that's where our CAS2 is necessarily very important. We've currently got 850 spaces. We're ramping up by the end of 25 to 1,350.
And other options as well for supporting bail, electronic tagging, I think was mentioned, which has been around for a long time, but I was really excited to hear in the House in debate talking about tags that monitor alcohol use, I think, and things like that, and that's really exciting for an old prosecutor like me. But I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about those sorts of options or new style options that would support people on bail as opposed to remanding in custody.
I can give you a good example of the sobriety tags, as they're called. They have a 97% compliance rate, and I actually tried one. Not because I was sentenced to anything, but as part of my job as a minister to see how it actually works and what it's like to be someone who has one of these tags on. And I won't go into the details, but I was tasked to make sure that the sobriety tag had to make some readings. So I successfully did that, but unfortunately it was on a Tuesday evening, so it wasn't great from work on Wednesday. But I'm a big believer in technology for managing offenders in the community, and that's why I'm going to Spain in a couple of weeks' time. They're doing some really interesting things there, and it's not just on basic tagging, it's around pushing. So offenders have basically a bracelet on that reminds them of when they need to go and see their probation officer, when they need to go and for various appointments, and also and I don't know the details on this, and I'm looking forward to learning, is around how victims can get much better information on where offenders are geographically, and also just giving better information for them. So, hopefully in due course I'll be able to come back to this committee to update you on what the options are, but I'm really excited about them.
Just a couple of bits to add on tagging, if I may. So we've got 20,800 people on tags now. It's a really significant number. The biggest single group is court bail at 7,400-ish. So they are used a lot by courts already. There is definitely what we are seeking to do all the time is make the courts aware of what this tagging can do, the availability of the technology, etc. One of the big shifts, as well as alcohol monitoring, which is great, has been the shift to GPS, which of course not only means that we can know the offender was or wasn't where they should be in the curfew, but it can actually locate them and can locate them. So, for example, if there is a crime, can locate them in the vicinity of the crime. We have used it in several successful prosecutions. The police force are delighted with the kind of information that you can get from it. So GPS tagging is a real kind of technology step forward.
Thank you. Pam,
just on that point about technology, as a committee we want to look at data and digital strategies across our work programme. Do you have a data and digital strategy currently?
Yes, we do. We're looking at investments in data and digital in a number of areas. The department's got excellent work improving data linking, which is obviously a key part of building the evidence base on this. We will be looking at additional technology to support community sentences, some of which have already been sort of talked about. So I think that I agree. I think there's a lot of exciting potential in this area.
We were in Brixton last week. Every record we saw was paper record, paper file for every prisoner. And I just want, every government service is going through a digital transformation and how we might work together on that.
Indeed.
I completely agree. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would get rid of as much paper as possible in prisons because we want to just improve the amount of time that officers have on the wings, talking to prisoners, sitting down and building those important relationships rather than filling out forms or looking where they put the paper.
Just to add, you're absolutely right to look at it across the portfolio because, of course, one of the things you were probably looking at was records that have been right through the system, through the CPS, through the courts, through the police, etc. So it is really important we try to look to do this end to end.
So prisoners arriving in a reception centre and nobody having any information about them, despite there being lots of information about them elsewhere.
Pam, I think it's you next as well.
Yes, very quickly on the on a very important matter, the Women's Justice Board. Government has said prisons aren't working for women. What would you say are the alternatives?
Well, I'm really pleased that the Women's Justice Board is being formed, and we'll be announcing it hopefully in the new year. And the experts we're going to have on the board are really going to help us provide strategic vision and direction in reforming women's justice to deliver the priorities, which are really, really clear. And I do believe we need to look at diverting women away from the criminal justice system in many cases. I've been going to women's prisons since the age of 9 because my mother was a foster carer and she used to look after babies. And I never actually went in the prison when I was a baby. When I was a young child, we used to sit in the car park while my mum went in. But I've been going to Style Prison probably 6 times a year for probably 20 years, and I continually see a number of women who are very ill, mentally ill, prolific self-harmers, and I just believe a number of those women should be diverted away. The large number, I think it's 68% are there for non-violent offences. So prison very much has its purpose, but when we're talking about diverting women away, there are, and I'm sure you've heard of some really good examples of residential women's centres. I mentioned about the intensive supervision court in Birmingham, and some of the things we touched on around technology as well. So I think the Women's Justice Board is a really exciting move, and I think it's really important, not just that we get the right ideas, but we get the delivery done as well. And I think it's a really important step. And I'm looking forward to coming back in due course and telling you, how we're getting on and what the plans are and the delivery plans.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask one question on the youth estate? We received a letter from Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector, today about the analysis of children in custody up 2023-24. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but it says, among other things, more children in custody felt unsafe last year, in fact, double the number of the year before. Children spending the majority of their time locked in their cells with little done to address their offending. violence and conflict on the wings. Only half felt cared for by staff. I mean, this is a pretty desperate catalogue. What's your response to that?
We're very concerned about the youth estate, and it's another part of HMPPS that we inherited that's under severe pressure. It's not my specific area of responsibility, that's Nick Dakin. But one of the things that I've known about for a long time is the complex nature of the young people who are in custody, and the needs that they have to help them so when they are released that they don't go back in. And they're very vulnerable young people. And I've read Charlie Taylor's reports, and maybe I'll just hand over to Amy to say what's your reading on things.
Yes, look, I'm sure Minister Dakin will want to come and speak to the committee about it. He is focused on both short-term and long-term plans, so short-term remedial actions, increasing the times out of custody, time out of cell, etc. But also, what are our medium to long-term plans for youth to stay? Colleagues will know we opened the first secure school, and so we're very interested to see what that will do and whether it will change the landscape and whether that will give us other options in the system, etc.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. The Tessamount.
Yes, thank you. Back to Charlie Taylor, I'm afraid, and he's issued 4 urgent notifications in this year, 3 in the last 3 months. And I wonder whether that you anticipate that you're expecting more, and whether that's going to become increasingly common. It sounds from some of the things you've said that it wouldn't be a surprise if there were more. And I wondered how, the second part of my question is, how does the prison service address the things that he raises? How do you respond?
Okay, so to answer your question, will there be more? I hope not, but there may well be. Not to sound like a broken record, we've inherited a really difficult situation here. Mm-hmm. But I don't want you to think that that Manchester and Winchester and Rochester are good examples of what we're saying. We have some fantastic prisons. You go and see HMP Oakwood, you go and see HMP Hatfield, Drake Hall, and there's a number of others that you go and see, and these are world-class establishments. But there is a set process involved of what happens after an urgent notification, which Amy will just take us through in a minute. But I also think one of the things that's important is what I do as the leader of this, as the minister in charge. So I've been to Manchester, I'm going to Winchester the week after next. I'm on it on these, and I think what the team needs is support, because we have staff who work really hard, we have governors who really want to turn things around. Amy and the team are really focused on supporting them. So I see my role as very much being someone who supports them and works out with the team what are the things that they need to turn things around and really support them. Because the number of prisons over the years, if you take the example of Liverpool, maybe 10 years ago, it was in a dreadful state, an urgent notification, and it's now a prison that has completely turned around, and the team have done a really good job. So it does happen. I'm in regular contact with Charlie Taylor on a weekly basis. In fact, I'm seeing him tomorrow. But maybe, Amy, if you take us through what are the steps to actually get that done.
A couple of bits of detail. We've got 8 prisons that we're actively trying to manage and improve under the urgent notification process at the moment. In terms of the process, within 28 days of receiving an urgent notification, we would publish an action plan. That action plan normally has 2 parts to it. One thing, things that are very specific locally, and then there are often themes. So we've covered quite a lot of them today: staffing, maintenance, consistency of senior leaders, physical infrastructure, etc. One of the things, and Liverpool is a good example, that we try to do is to perhaps close some places to relieve some pressure. That has obviously been very difficult in the last couple of years. We're trying to do it at Wandsworth now, for example. That's both, just as the Minister said, to give the establishment an opportunity to kind of get on top of the stuff it needs to, but also because often we need to do physical infrastructure and maintenance work, etc., and that's very difficult unless you can take a block. So, for example, in Wandsworth at the moment, we're trying to refurbish showers, boilers, flooring, windows, all of those sorts of things. So the process we go through is writing an action plan, then delivering it, but seeing what we can do to really give it the biggest boost to help it get back on its feet. One of, I think, though, the honest learnings that that we've experienced, again, just as the Minister said right at the beginning of this session, is I think we have a lot of success, in all honesty, by focusing support and improving a prison in 3 to 5 months. It's a different question about whether it sticks in 3 to 5 years. And so we really need to ask ourselves properly, how do we get a sustained, continued improvement in these places? And it's not for lack of brilliant leadership. Lots of these places have got our best leaders in, but they are the most difficult places to run. And so it's looking at that consistent staffing, it's looking at the regular investment and all those things. And we are really asking ourselves now, look, what is the 3 to 5 year journey we can go on for these places?
Thank you. So one of the concerns that's raised is self-inflicted deaths. And I wonder whether you would want to comment on that and how you see the ability to reduce the number of deaths in prisons.
First of all, self-inflicted deaths at last reporting are slightly down.
Sorry, can you say it again?
Sorry, self-inflicted deaths at the last published reporting are very slightly down, but one death is too many, so I don't want to over-focus on that. I also don't want to say to you there's a really simple action plan we can do for this, because we are talking about, as you will appreciate, very complex problems. We're also talking about a lot of trauma and a lot of problems that are being imported from outside into prison. Look, we're trying to do a number of things. One is identification. So at the moment they come into prison identifying that they might have needs. Some of those might be acute mental health needs that need support with maybe out of prison, but certainly with our kind of healthcare staff in prison. Some of it might be more mentoring support and support that we can actively do on the wing. One of the things we've got going at the moment is a pilot in 6 reception prisons, including Preston, where we're trying to do peer resilience. So we're trying to kind of really invest with a course delivered by other people with lived experience, etc., about how they can be emotionally resilient during the time in prison. We obviously then have a framework for actively monitoring with people that we're worried about. It's called ACT. Where we have a form and we try and monitor people, investing in staff training. But then, for example, if we look to the women's estate, where the self-harm problem really is acute, 8 times that we experience in the male estate, we're trying to pilot a lot of different things as well. Social workers, so we know that family ties, for example, is one of the big problems. So in 4 of our 12 women's prisons, we've got social workers in, and we're trying to work on family ties, etc. We're trying to do some more psychology-led approaches, particularly with our women that are kind of prolific self-harmers. And then we're working really hand in glove with our healthcare partners to try and work it with our relatively few, but women and men who prolifically self-harm and really do have lots of instances of it. So we do a lot all the time, but we have to keep asking ourselves this question, because it's an enormous challenge for prisoners and staff.
And the ACT stuff is effective, you think?
Yes, we do think it's an effective framework. I'm separate question about always improving it and always reviewing it, which we do. As I'm sure you know, after any death in custody, even if it's not self-inflicted, we have a PPO. They will look, for example, was the individual on an ACT? Should they have been? What was the quality of those ACT entries like, etc.? But we also know that things like regime and getting people out of their cell, these are all very, very important things.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for sticking with us for a little longer. We're going to move on to talk about organised crime in prison. Obviously, we know that prisons are hard to get out of, we hope, but the public are often shocked to hear about the drug use in prison. Of course, there's those that are made with components within, spice, but far too much is getting in. We know that there's data around the increase of drone activity around prisons, but from your knowledge, what are the most common methods being used to get drugs into prison?
When it comes to the whole area of serious organised crime, it really worries me. We estimate it's about 10% of the prison population have connections with serious organised crime, and it's a big risk to security, stability, and how we can reduce reoffending. Because I've been going around prisons for 25 years, and I think this is a significant problem we need to tackle and we need to take very seriously and at pace. They have phones, they smuggle phones in. the reason why they smuggle phones in, so they can carry on their business outside of prison. And they can also find ways of getting drugs and illicit substances into prison. When they sell drugs in prison, they can create prisoner debt, and it creates more violence. And we are the added complexities this brings is a serious problem. And at the end of the day, this is not helpful for what I want to do, which is reduce reoffending. So we need to tackle this. And you're right. I'm really pleased you've raised it, because this is the one thing that really concerns me at the moment. I'm really pleased with the approach. I spent a lot of time with the team on one of the areas we really need to focus on. And I know Amy and the team are also aware of the complexities of the way they operate in prison and outside of prison. But maybe, Amy, if you can come on to the details of how things are getting in and the specific area of drones.
Just in terms of methods of entry, it will vary from site to site. It also varies over time, because if we get very good at blocking one route, you'll find they're pretty good at switching to another. Main routes are prisoners smuggling it in themselves, to which we have tried to do enhanced gate searching, security, etc. in our most troubled sites. Throwovers, so literally try and throw it over where there's netting or whatever that you can get it through, drones, and to a much smaller extent, sometimes by staff or partners that work with us in the prison.
And in terms of the staffing side of things, what's the level of vetting for a prison staff working on the ground?
So we have a good standard level of vetting for prison staff. We also have a basic level of vetting for anyone who comes into the prison, etc. We also have a couple of other things, though. We've got a staff corruption unit. We've got about 150 staff in that, so we are actively, just like the police and other services, trying to ensure that standards of professional standards are met. We try to educate staff because some of these players are looking for weakness. They are quite adept at corrupting staff, etc. So we try to train staff both when they join and regularly afterwards. Look out for it, look for support, look for how we can support people, etc. So there is a number of ways we try to counter the risks that obviously are there.
And where does it fall into the vetting category? Is this SC, CT, DV?
So it will depend on exactly the type and nature of prison, that you're working at, because obviously if you're working at a Cat D, quite different than you're working in a high security estate, etc. So it does depend on the level of the prison, but we have a good standard basic level.
Okay, and is there consideration for bringing it into the vetting standards of other organisations, for example, the police?
So a higher level of vetting. So one of the things that we have been considering is not so much necessarily a higher kind of basic standard level of vetting, but things like when do we want to do enhanced checks of social media, that kind of thing. So how we get on top of social media checks as part of vetting, which wouldn't necessarily change the total standard, but might change what we put in the package. Does that make sense?
Yes. And is there monitoring of staff relationships with prisoners? Because obviously that is where this problem can begin, with the sort of recruitment of prison officers.
Absolutely. So I mentioned we've got a corruption unit that tries to look and manage at exactly that. We do get a regular number of convictions every year. So we're not just monitor it, we take them right through police prosecution, etc. And we do get criminal justice outcomes. But also, like I say, particularly at the low levels, what we try and do is support people, because you're absolutely right that what you want to do is stop the relationship at the point at which you start to have concern. One of the things we're trying to do about that, as I think I mentioned earlier, is have good mentoring and good support, so that when brand new staff are coming in, that they can kind of learn from more experienced staff about the appropriate relationships and boundaries, etc.
Thank you. And how are you working at the moment with other law enforcement agencies, so police, National Crime Agency, to form that intelligence picture within the prisons?
So as you might expect, I meet with them really regularly, work really closely. We are trying to think at the moment in the area of serious organised crime. I mean, you've obviously got a bit of a speciality in this, about the model we've used for counter-terrorism, which has been really, really effective in the way we've worked with other agencies, and we're trying to think about whether we could roll that out. The numbers are very different, though, in SOCs than they are in CT, so we will have to think about the kind of model that we could apply, and we are thinking about how we could work on that together and use. So we work very closely, but we want to use the formula that we've used in CT and see if we can apply it to SOC.
That's good to hear. Fantastic. And then finally, in terms of randomised drugs testing, how successful is that? And a question from what was raised earlier, are there tags that can also detect drug use?
I mean, so far as random drug testing, I mean, I was quite shocked when I came into the office in the beginning of July that because of the capacity problems, random drug testing hadn't been at the volumes it should have been. And when a prison is 99.9% full, the most you can do is get people a clean pair of pants, 3 meals a day, and a shower. And random drug testing takes time. It's important. I think looking forward, is one of the things that I've stressed to the team. I think we need to do this very proactively. We're also interested in new technology coming through on random drug testing. We're also doing a lot more water-based testing in the sewage system for drugs. But I think it's really important. We don't just test, we also encourage people not to take drugs. So drug-free wings, incentivised substance-free living wings. I've seen some really good examples. The one at Oakwood is I think, world-class. And the way the prisoners engage in it is really important. So I do think it's important that we have a deterrent, that we test, and we know what our problems are. But I also think on the other side, we need to have the carrot as well.
One final question, please, Chair, going back slightly, actually. In terms of the prison estate, what are the rules around vehicle searches for, be it visitors or prison staff, when they come onto the government-owned estate?
So again, vehicle searches will vary according to the category of the prison, but at any closed site, we would expect the underside of a vehicle to be searched. We would expect a physical search of any apertures, so boots opening, etc. And we would actually expect that the cars didn't come into the grounds, pass through the gate unless absolutely necessary. So only a small number of kind of vetted vehicles should be coming in and out.
And do prison staff park within the boundaries of the estate?
Not in a closed site.
Thank you.
Yeah, car park.
Thank you, Chair.
One supplementary for Lizzie.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick question. You mentioned the phones in prison and organised crime groups essentially continuing with their business model from within prison. I'm just wondering, you've said that you work with other agencies as well. If you receive intelligence to suggest that there's an operation going on in one of your prisons from an OCG, do you have the opportunity to move and disrupt those groups by moving people around? And if so, how has the prison capacity issues impacted on those sorts of methods that you can use?
I'm sure you'll understand there are certain things we can't really talk about in public, the way we manage some of these challenges. But if I just touch on the capacity issue, 100% right. When you can't move anybody around, you can't deal with difficult prisoners, and there are ways of moving people around. But maybe there's some specifics. I'll hand over to you.
Are you moving more dangerous prisoners to lower category prisoners as a result?
Should I just try and answer both of the questions? So on the first part, obviously I'm slightly constrained in what I would say in this kind of audience, but broadly speaking, on your question, we would never allow capacity or anything else to interfere in an individual. If we had intel in an individual, we would move that individual. What capacity absolutely does do is affect our ability to manage relative volumes. So the number of people you're trying to manage at one site versus another, for example. It also pushes a lot of prisoners out of area, which creates its own tensions and its own problems, etc. So not at the individual level, absolutely at the bulk level, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Right, we're going to move on to IPP. Alex?
That's right, thank you, Chair. So, as the Chair said, I want to just ask a few questions on IPP. And I note that the annual report, the IPP annual report, was laid before Parliament, I think on Friday. I would gently say, I think the committee noted it's a non-sitting Friday, which does somewhat hamper our ability to effectively scrutinise it. So I hope that was just a one-off, but hopefully your letter, Lord Timpson, to the Chair of today sort of underscored the government's desire to being determined to drive further progress in improving the standards, the prospects, of those serving IPP sentences, which is welcome to read. I wonder if you would agree with the view of the previous Lord Chancellor, who referred to IPP sentences as a stain on our justice system.
Firstly, I apologise about the Friday date. I had a very in-depth and challenging debate in the other house on Friday, so it was very much an IPP day. I'm very clear that IPP sentenced prisoners we need to do all we can to help them get out safely and protect the public. I've been fortunate in my role running the Timpson business to work with a number of people on IPP sentences. They're fantastic. They turn their lives around, they're great colleagues, ambitious, got stuck in. But I also am aware of the complex nature of the whole range of the 2,964 people on IPP sentences. And you know, the parole board has a key role, but as does the IPP action plan. And at the moment, we've got 30% of our IPP sentence prisoners in the wrong prison to do all they need to do to get the right courses and the right skills. So we want to have a successful parole hearing. And I'm also really pleased with the way that the HMPPS team is galvanising around this. And you know, I'm pushing it as hard as I can. I'm spending a huge amount of time on this area because I'm so passionate about helping these people get out safely. But we need to do all we can. It is absolutely vital that they get the support that they need in the right prison.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I note your letter to the chair of the committee referred to sort of your passion for that, and I think I can say on behalf of the committee that we'll be a willing partner to sort of help and support in that. The figure you just read out, I'm presuming, is the total number of individuals currently serving an IPP sentence. What proportion of that, though, are still in custody beyond their original minimum tariff?
2,694 in custody. Mm-hmm. Of those, 1,095, 9 of whom are women, have never been released, and 1,599, 25 of whom are women, have been recalled to custody. And as of November the 1st, we had 1,742 IPP licences automatically terminated, and there's another stage in February next year when we hope more will have their licences automatically terminated. So one of the things I'm also conscious of when we say 2,694 people, they're all people with and we need to really focus on them because they just need our support.
And you mentioned already about the 30% of IPP prisoners who aren't in the right place where they need to be. And I think this ties to an experience we had at HMP Brixton last week where we saw and spoke with the teams there about the London Pathways unit and the successes when the individuals are in the right place, about their kind of successes. So what support you've recognised as a problem that and that is pleasing to see, but what support are we giving in order to ensure that that London Pathways unit is an example, but what examples of other things are you doing that can sort of help IPP prisoners in that regard?
I'll just give you one example in the parole board, and then I'll hand over to Amy on other things that we're doing. So the IPP task force is made up of 25 members of the parole board who are just specialists focusing, they psychology backgrounds, psychiatry backgrounds, and these are focusing just on IPP sentence prisoners parole board hearings, so we can really focus on those. So that's one of the things, but there's a lot more we can do.
Yeah, I mean, straightforward answer to your question is absolutely robust individual action plans, and that's what we've committed. So trying to take the individual, say what do they need at which point in their sentence, which that can be complicated because it's very difficult to throw everything at people all at once. It does need to be properly sequenced, etc. Then committing to that, using the pathways, using psychologists, using the parole board team to make sure we try and get them the most help that they can. But the other problem is, in fact, the bigger problem for those in custody is recall, and that's why we've been looking at licence periods, etc. as well.
And very quickly, one final one, Chair, is just, I think in recent correspondence with the committee, there was discussion about the government not being willing to explore whether an expert committee could be tasked with devising a scheme to enable IPP prisoners to be resentenced. So I just wonder if you can perhaps explain a little bit more about that to the committee.
Yeah, I'm very clear that I trust the parole board's decision making on risk, and public safety has got to be our number one priority. And the track record of the parole board in assessing risk is the number of serious further offences following a parole board hearing is 0.5%. And I don't think resentencing and people being released automatically will help improve public safety at all. and it's our job to keep the public safe. So that's why I think what we're doing with the IPP action plan and really focusing in on supporting IPP offenders to get out safely is what we need to be focusing on.
Yeah. Could I, as we raise that issue, just say we're writing to you, hopefully tomorrow, or we will write to you in relation to this issue of resentencing. We understand there's a difference of opinion between what the previous committee said on that and what your view and governments, both this and the previous governments, is. But we think there's been some misunderstanding in terms of what the committee said previously. Rather than go through it length today, it would be helpful if you could look at what we say and come back on that. I think we're all trying to achieve the same ends, but I think that we need to understand each other's position on that.
Of course.
Have you finished that?
Yes, I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm not going to try and do justice to rehabilitation and the Operations and Probation Service and other issues that we were still hoping to cover because of the time, but also because we are going to return to these issues early in the new year. And we may well ask whether you can come back and talk to us about that as part of an inquiry that we're doing. However, I am aware that Sir Ashley Fox was going to ask some questions on this, so in the few minutes we've got left, Ashley, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, if I may, about the new prison education contracts. I understand these were due to start from April 2025. Is that still the case? And if not, when do you anticipate that they will start?
On the details, I'll hand over to Amy, but one of the things that I'm looking to do is to set up a prison education advisory board to gather a group of experts in education to really support the HMPPS team on exactly this subject, on future direction we go on education, who do we work with to provide education.
So we've secured an extension to the existing contract, so it will be a bit later. We're working through the precise timings of when would be the best time to turn on those new contracts right now, in light of new governments and in light of allocations, etc. as well.
So what caused the delay? Because my understanding is you started the tender in September 2023, so that's more than 12 months ago. The original timetable was for a decision in October 24. So why has this been delayed? What's the cause of that?
So in part, the general election was the reason for the delay. Also, as the Minister has just said, we really want to try and maximise what we can get out of those prison education contracts. So we are really trying to think about how we can get the best value for money, the most hours that we possibly can, etc. And so we've been also making sure that we've got some flexibility in those contracts to try and, if we can, maximise the number of hours we can get for prisoner learning.
When you say the general election interfered with the process, you're suggesting that the tender process was stopped because you weren't happy with what was originally being asked for? There's been a change of policy.
Not necessarily a change of policy. I think what we're trying to do is maximise the flexibility that we have got in those contracts to make sure that we can get the most we possibly can out of those education hours.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that the policy has changed.
Could you describe to me how you hope these new contracts will differ from the old ones and what will flow from that?
So there's a couple of things. Like I say, I think we're hoping to maximise hours. We're also hoping to really focus in on the core basics. Colleagues might know, but literacy and maths, and in particular reading, has been something that's been very close to my heart, because I just think it's a basic building block. So we're trying to focus in more on, if you like, the kind of core subjects. We're also trying to think about how we can build education into other areas in the prison. So, for example, workshops, etc., to maximise that use, and to give as much flexibility locally as we can to local governors, etc. The other thing that we have done is we've employed experts. So we've now got people with education background who are leading the management of these contracts locally. You might have met them at Brixton, in fact, when you went.
And I think one of the things I'm interested in longer term is how we can use technology better within a prison to help someone's education. And there's some really good examples of in-cell technology. Basically, it's a tablet. There's coracle computers. There's a number of different methods where people, when they're in their cells and everyone's locked up, they can still learn, they can do courses, they can do open university courses and so on. So I think we need to think longer term around how we really embrace technology.
And you'll presumably have to deal with the issue of security in granting prisoners access to these tablets and access to the internet?
Yeah, it's a pretty well managed situation at the moment. So there's, for example, at Five Wells, they have a really good internal system. It's not connected to the internet at all. It's very much an internal system. And there's a company called Coracle that supply laptops in prisons, and the prisoners treat them immaculately. I mean, even some of these computers that have been 6-7 years old, they're so precious to them because this is their one way of learning. And again, it's not connected up to the internet at all. It's preloaded education and news and so on. And you know, I think it really gives them a much better way of, when they are released, of integrating back in, because they understand how to use a computer. I remember many years ago recruiting a guy from prison, and he was working in the office and he couldn't use a mouse because he had never seen one before, because he'd been in prison for 15 years. So yeah, I think we need to really get that right.
And finally, if I may, Chair, you referred to basic literacy and numeracy. Yes, that's important. But what about vocational skills as part of that educational experience?
Absolutely, hugely important. We know that there is a strong link between those vocational skills, getting employment, and then not having repeat offending. But what we're trying to do is build the basic literacy and numeracy into those vocational skills and try and make more of a link that way.
I think what was important for me as an employer in my previous job is people need to have the basic skills, but they didn't need to be experts in maths and English, but they need to be able to do the basics. And one of the things that we learned through the training academies we opened up within prisons is you want to pick the right person who's got the right ambitions and the right personality, and they often need support beyond the classroom support when you start developing them in the role, because they're adding new skills on. It could be understanding how health and safety works, or so there's a lot more that we need to teach them if they're going to be job ready, but getting the basics right is absolutely vital.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring the meeting to a close. Could I thank the Minister and his officials for coming and appearing to us, for giving such full and frank answers, particularly for staying late, because I think we've learnt nothing else today. We've learnt that you're a man who is going to have his time occupied quite fully in the coming months and years. So we wish you all the best of luck with that. And with that, I will close the meeting. Order.